How sure are you that Plato was a real flesh and blood person? Go ahead and pause the video and ask yourself that question seriously. How sure are you that a guy named Plato actually existed and that he wrote all of these works that he is currently given credit for? Did you ask yourself that question? Don't lie to me. I swear to God, the choking will begin if the lies continue. No, you didn't pause it, did you? That's okay. I would not have paused it either. I would not be taking orders from some stupid YouTube guy in the first place anyways. So I would just continue listening on. And that's fine. It's all good. So we have a very serious problem when we start to look back at ancient history. And in all honesty, this problem is prevalent in essentially almost all of history. But the problem that we inevitably will run into and will generally be ignored by just about everybody is the problem of proving that these individual characters in history actually ever existed. Now, I get it. Right now, a lot of you are probably going, wait, are you insinuating that Plato never existed? I mean, bro, we have all of these books on Plato. I mean, there's literally libraries about Plato. I mean, everybody talks about Plato. Are you telling me that Plato's not real? Yeah, that's actually exactly what I am claiming. Sort of. Now, on this channel, I've already done a show that went over the possibility that Plato never actually existed in the sense that we generally think of Plato as now. And by that I mean, a pre-Hellenistic period philosopher who did all of these writings and had a hand in everything from philosophy, to mathematics, geometry, etc. This guy was all over the place. That show goes over all kinds of historical and scientific evidence that really does shed a completely different light on whoever Plato actually was. And yes, I realize that if you are not familiar with that show and all of that evidence, that already this premise sounds insane. But before you shut this down and hit that dislike button and unsubscribe from the channel, think about this really fast. Like I said, ask yourself a question. How do you know Plato was a real flesh and blood person who lived between 427 and 347 BC? What scientific evidence convinced you that he was a real person? I mean, what was it? Ask yourself that question. What is it that really made you believe that the way the mainstream talks about Plato being a real person is 100% valid? On a scientific level. I'm not looking to appeal to authorities. Remember, appeal to authority, that does not work. So you cannot say, well, I mean, all these guys in these universities with high-level degrees, I mean, they all say Plato's real, so he must be real. That is not acceptable. That doesn't work. That's not scientific, and that is not accurate historically anyway. What convinced you that Plato is a real person that lived almost, 2,400 years ago? I guarantee you, your answer, if you ask yourself this honestly and you stay objective, your answer has to be, well, I don't have anything. I mean, there's actually no real evidence, scientifically speaking, that proves, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that somebody named Plato existed during that period of time. That is a scientific conclusion. Remember, science does not care about our feelings. Scientifically speaking, we do not have any evidence that Plato was a real person. As we have no choice but to follow the conclusions of real science, what this means is that if Plato was not real, if Plato did not exist 2,500-ish years ago or so, what does that mean for all of his writings? Where did they come from? And more importantly, what does that mean for something like the story of Atlantis? Yeah, it screws stuff up, doesn't it? Because right now, if you're an Atlantis researcher, one of your main go-to stories is going to be whatever Plato recorded. And Plato did record a little bit of detail there that really has been helpful to researchers in an effort to try to, replicate or rebuild whatever the hell was going on back in the day during that particular time where a continent in the Atlantic Ocean existed. If Plato's not real, or I should say, if Plato is not somebody who lived 2,500 years ago, we suddenly wind up with several very weird and interesting problems. And the good news here is that these problems, once we kind of go through this and sort of solve them, or at least get on some equal playing ground relative to understanding what they truly mean, you like all that good word salad right there? What we are going to find is that there is an entire new world out there, historically and scientifically speaking, that we can now tap into. In this episode, I am not going to belabor the point that Plato may not have existed and probably never did exist. In this video, we are going to take the stance, following the scientific method and following the real historical evidence, that Plato never existed in the time period that people say he did. So if you don't want to operate under the assumption, as we are going to in this episode, that Plato was indeed not real and that something else completely different happened, go watch that episode really quick and then come back, because that will at least give you a good foundation on what we are going to discuss today. However, I will give a really fast recap so that we're all on the basic same page. So here's the deal. Right now, Plato is a figure considered to be alive between 427 and 347 BCE. He was supposedly born into an aristocratic family. He initially gets drawn into politics. However, after becoming a follower of Socrates, he shifts his focus to philosophy. He does that because he met somebody named Socrates. Everybody knows Socrates, or Socrates, we can call him that too, whatever. So he meets Socrates, becomes a philosopher, and then he starts writing his own philosophies. Generally speaking, Plato's philosophies are written in a dialogue format. And generally Socrates, or I should say generally the dialogues are Socrates versus Plato. Sort of, right? They're just bouncing ideas off each other and, talking back and forth. That's basically all of Plato's works. Now, here's the first problem that we run into with respect to Plato and his works. You have to remember that we do not have any original work from this period of time. There is not a single shred of text that was written in Plato's hand that we possess today. What we possess nowadays are supposed to be copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. This is a problem in its own right. So right now, mainstream historians literally believe that all of these copies of copies of copies have been transmitted down to us today 100% intact and unchanged. This is how insane modern historians are. Now, 2,500 years is a long time for anything, not just for works to be copied down, down the line until it reached us. 2,500 years, that is a ton of time for all kinds of crazy stuff to have happened, right? So, and it's not just his works that could have been messed with, retranslated differently, changed, etc. The very nature of that character's existence would have to also survive 2,500 years worth of the second law of thermodynamics. I mean, think about it. If you use common sense, do you honestly believe that the character of somebody that existed that long ago is really going to be faithfully transmitted down to us right now? I wish it was true that that was the case, but the reality is we have zero reason to believe that that would ever happen at all. All right, and we have even less of a reason to believe that all of these supposed works that were done back in the 300s BC are pristine and untouched. That is literally an insane position to hold. All right, so anyway, you get the point. Basically, the existence of Plato, it's already questionable if you just apply common sense. And as I said earlier in the show, there is no scientific evidence which proves Plato ever actually existed. Nobody can show me that. I mean, I'm happy to see it, right? If somebody actually has 100% testable scientific evidence that can prove that we can peer review, we can run tests on, and that predicts something, and then the outcome is ultimately that Plato is a real person and did exist during this period of time, fine. Like, I'm fine with that if you've got the evidence. The problem is, or the reality is, that evidence exists in absolutely no way, shape, or form. And there's no way around it. All right, this is just something you've got to come to terms with. So, scientifically speaking, we can right now say, or we don't have to believe, I guess I should say, that anybody existed named Plato during this period of time in a pre-Hellenistic period. So then what the hell is the truth? Well, here's the truth, and here's what is gone over more in that other episode that I did earlier on. So right now, if we look at chronology, what we find is that the classical Greek period and the Hellenistic period do not happen 2,500 years ago, but instead took place only around 800 or so years ago. All of the scientific and historical evidence, if you look at it objectively and you factor in real chronology, shows that the Hellenistic period ran congruent with the Renaissance period. So, long story short, essentially what has been discovered relative to chronology, that 1,800 years have been added to Greek chronology. Yeah, 1,800 years. If you delete 1,800 years, basically the time period from the Hellenistic period all the way up until essentially the 1300s, if you get rid of all those years, 1,800 years, what happens is that characters like Alexander the Great, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle no longer exist in some weird quasi-ancient Greek time, but they now exist around the 12 to 13 to 1400s AD. Yeah, I know it sounds crazy, but don't forget, this conclusion was reached by using real history and real science, and that is what the evidence shows us. So, what does that mean for Plato's works? Well, the first thing it means is that there is no such thing as Neoplatonism. Plato, as we know him, has a resurgence between the 13 and 1400s, and the reason why he has a resurgence, and it's one of several if you believe in mainstream chronology, the reason why he has a resurgence during this period of time is because a guy named Plato decides to start re-promoting Plato. And mainstream history acknowledges this. They know that Plato exists. They know that Plato, created another Neoplatonic period in time. But if we subtract 1,800 years and we get rid of all those other Neoplatonic time periods that pop up as well, what we find is the potential source of the writer who actually was Plato. So the question is this: is Plato Plato? And it does look like all of the evidence points to this being the case. So basically, Plato's works were not written back during an ancient Greece period of time. That means Plato's works were written during the Renaissance, and then they were carried on throughout that period of time. This makes a lot more sense in general, because what that means is that Plato, or supposedly Plato's works, they don't have to survive 2,500 years to reach us now. They've only got to survive like 700 or so years, and that's a lot easier to do, especially during this period of time in the Renaissance when this kind of stuff was being prolific, right? People were eating this up. They really wanted to copy this stuff, and they really wanted to sell it as well. But that's what was going on, right? So these kind of movements were happening during this period of time, during the Renaissance. It makes sense that some kind of a Platonic work would come out of this period. And mainstream won't argue with me on this. They happily say that yes, Plato started the Platonic school and he rekindled Neoplatonism. But is that true? The scientific evidence does not support this claim. What we have discovered is that Plato may have been writing under the pseudonym of Plato. You have to remember, during this period of time, these kinds of thought processes, this was stuff that could get you killed in some cases. And people were being executed for thinking along some of these lines. So what it looks like Plato ended up doing was, instead of, writing all these works during the Renaissance period and putting his name on them, instead what he did is that he created a character named Plato. And then what he told the authorities was that, hey, look, I found these books. They're not mine. I didn't write them, but they're interesting. I would like to explore them. So that kind of washed his hands of being in trouble relative to what all of the philosophies in Platonic works were gravitating towards. So he kind of covered his own butt. That makes a lot of sense if you think about it, right? If you're somebody who wants to write philosophy during a time where you can be executed for it, the smart move is to not put your name on it. It's to put somebody else's name on it and then try to wiggle, your way through it as you continue your works. And this looks like that is what happened. Now, if you're wondering about Socrates and Aristotle, because they orbit Plato as well, those characters also would have existed during this period of time. And in fact, there are historical characters that Plato is involved in which match up to Socrates and Aristotle. It's absolutely insane the way this works. And I know it sounds crazy, but that's what the evidence really shows. I mean, ask yourself this question: which makes more sense? That some dude named Plato, 2,500 years ago, 300 BCE, wrote all this cool, crazy philosophy stuff, and then it's just lost for like 12 to 1700 years until it magically reappears in perfect prose with perfect copies, and it's right there for everybody to read. Basically, it's almost like those 1800 years between Plato and Plato never existed. Remember, the Dark Ages, and that's almost any Dark Age that exists in mainstream chronology right now, never happened. Those years never took place. There is no history there, as you can see, because we don't have any history for them. Remember, mainstream historians literally say that there's these huge Dark Ages in history, but they have no evidence for the Dark Age, so that's why the Dark Age must exist. Like, that is literally their logic. That is how unbelievably ridiculous mainstream historians are. Okay, I'm just complaining now. All right, so basically, what we found is that Plato is more than likely Plato. So, who the hell is this Plato guy? Well, basically, Plato was a Byzantine philosopher who lived between around 1350-ish to around 1450-ish AD. He is credited by the mainstream as reinvigorating Plato again, and then of course the rest is history from there on. But we are going to follow real evidence, and we are going to make the claim that Plato did all of Plato's writings. If Plato, a dude who existed between the 1350s and 1450s AD, wrote all of Plato's works, especially something like Timaeus, what does that mean for all the historical information that is contained in those works? This is where Atlantis comes into play, and this is what I want to talk about, because, man, the problem with Atlantis, like, I'm not a blind believer, by the way, really fast, so everybody understands where I'm coming from. I'm not a blind believer in, Atlantis sinking, some futuristic cities with, flying cars and fax machines, and people were running around slapping each other with fly swatters, cybernetic fly swatters. Like, I'm not, I don't fall into that category. But I am open to the possibility of land masses sinking, because there's nothing unscientific about that possibility. The reason why I even started this show today is because in my own research, what I've discovered is that if I approach history from a purely scientific perspective, what we find is that you cannot ignore sinking land masses on this planet. It's impossible. You literally cannot study ancient history and get away from the concept of sinking continents and land rising from the ocean. And the reason why is simple. It's because everybody on this planet has histories of all of this. There is no way around this. The problem with Atlantis is that Atlantis has become this weird catch-all for any kind of an advanced civilization in the past, and any continent that would have sank at all on the planet is now generally always called Atlantis. And this is both by the mainstream and the alternative mainstream. This is not the way to look at this problem. The better way, of course, the better way to look at the problem would to just read all the individual cultures on this planet's history that deal with sinking continents and take them at face value. What I find interesting nowadays in the alternative scientific community, or the alternative historical community as well, mainly the historical community, and not so much the mainstream, because the mainstream, they don't care about Atlantis, they don't care about any of that stuff, so I'm not even going to deal with them. But what I see in the alternative mainstream is that once somebody hears about a sinking landmass of some sort, that landmass immediately has to be labeled Atlantis. And I'd argue that this approach is probably one of the biggest barriers, self-imposed barriers, that alternative researchers suffer from, for the simple reason is that even if you are on the alternative side and you think you are being objective, the vast majority of alternative historians and researchers really have a tough time wrapping their head around the potential possibility of multiple continents sinking on this planet simultaneously. Now, this is a weird problem because let's think about this really quick. Let's solve this problem, all right? Because we really need to get people away from blaming every kind of a sinking situation on Atlantis, when our ancestors don't say that. Our ancestors all over this planet make it very clear that not only was there one continent that sank, but there were multiple continents and countless islands that went down during a very particular catastrophic period in Earth's past. Oh, and by the way, this period of time was not that long ago. This was only a few thousand years ago. And the work by Plato relative to Timaeus and Atlantis can actually maybe help us get a better date going relative to when this event took place. That's kind of what I want to discuss today, among other things. I know, it's a Schizo Babel. We're going to go all over the place. Just bear with me. So let's cover the sinking continent problem first, and let's go through why we need to pull ourselves out of blaming Atlantis for every kind of continent sinking story that we hear. Let's start with actually the core problem. Why do we even have this problem in the first place? Why do we find a situation to where, really good alternative researchers, they go out there, they look at the evidence, and when they start to find these stories of a sinking landmass, they suddenly stop taking the stories at face value, and if they are going to believe the sinking, everybody just immediately assumes Atlantis. Now, this is a weird problem to have, and the reason why we have it at all is because of psychology. Yeah, I know, we gotta cover some of this because it's important. Remember, if you don't understand the basics of human psychology, real, raw human psychology, you will never understand history. And as I'll show you guys right now, you're not even gonna understand how to do real research because you'll be getting in your own way. So let me help you get out of your way really quick. Why do we have this weird proclivity of alternative historical researchers blaming everything on Atlantis if they're willing to go that far at all, right? That's a problem as well. Well, the reason why we find ourselves in this situation is because of the way people have been trained in the Western world on a psychological basis. The reality is, you, me, I am not immune to this either, and everybody that you know in the Western world has been exposed to an ungodly amount of social programming. Some of this programming has been designed to make sure that when you hear of a subject like a sinking continent, that you will immediately discard it as a conspiracy theory. And quite literally, most people will use that term. And the reason why most people will use the term conspiracy theory is because, once again, that is the term they have been programmed to trigger off of. And then, of course, it's a label that that person can put on other humans that creates a sense of division because you think that person is crazy. And then, of course, ultimately what is created is a divide and conquer situation on a very low level, or in this case, on a historical/academic level. See how that works? There's always multiple facets to programming, by the way. It's not just like one thing. It's not like the high people in society, whoever the hell they are, right? The powers that be. I mean, those guys, they probably do have information on stuff like this, and they probably do have something closer to the truth, and they might be hiding it from you and me. I mean, there's a really good chance that that is the case. And so what they've done is they've put this kind of programming into the social conditioning to make sure that your average person will never believe a story about a sinking continent. Now, if you're one of those people that have been able to rise above that programming, and there's a lot of you, which is awesome, you're going to hit another psychological barrier. The next barrier you are going to hit is that, yes, maybe you'll believe in one sinking continent, but multiple sinking continents? Ah, come on, bro. I mean, maybe one. Fine. Atlantis, there's some writings about it, and I'm willing to go that far. But come on, you can't tell me continents all over the planet were sinking. That's crazy, bro. Nothing crazy about that at all. Once again, everything I just said is scientifically possible. There is nothing insane about multiple continents sinking at the same point in time. However, Western psychological conditioning has made it almost impossible to believe that that is the case. So we need to work within the framework of this programming, and we got to break it. We got to get out of it. We cannot be stuck believing that only, one continent went down. And the simple reason why, by the way, you shouldn't believe that anyway is, here, let's do some science really quick. Let's do some geology. Think about this. All right, if you're willing to believe Atlantis went down, all right, cool, not bad, good. There's good reason to believe it did, right? We have all kinds of geological evidence. I mean, look at the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. There is literally a gigantic rip all the way through that area. I mean, you would think that would count for something for mainstream, but it doesn't mean anything to those people, all right? But we also find a situation to where cultures surrounding the Atlantic Ocean, they also talk about a sinking continent. And in fact, some of them literally say that's where they came from. Yeah, South America has a lot of stories like that. We'll have to talk about that later. Anyway, so there's precedence historically from our ancestors to believe at least one went down. And then nowadays, if we look at the topography of the ocean bottom, yeah, you could easily believe that something happened there that absolutely destroyed a continent. Fine, fair enough. But now if we travel beyond the Atlantic Ocean and we start to look at other cultures, if we start to look at East Asia, Australia, New Zealand, India, etc., places like this which are nowhere near the Atlantic Ocean, why do these guys also have stories of sinking continents? The mistake that most people will make at this point is they will simply say, well, everybody knew about Atlantis and everybody describes Atlantis going down. There is an immediate problem with this outlook. The cultures that are talking about sinking land masses do not recount the exact same story of the Atlantis story itself. The only similarities that we find in these different cultures is just that, yes, some sort of landmass sank, but that's where it ends. The rest of all these other cultures' stories, and by other cultures, I mean non-Atlantic cultures, they all have very unique perspectives. And in fact, even the sinking land masses are described differently. For example, we have people talking about tons of islands sinking in the area where they lived. We also have them discussing tons of other islands rising up out of the ocean. We don't find that, for example, in the Atlantis story. Take Lemuria, for example. The way Lemuria is described by the people that surround the Indian Ocean area, it has nothing to do with Atlantis. It's a completely different story. But the problem is that mainstream alternative researchers will look at this and they will say, no, they must be confused, or we're not reading it right. No, the only continent that went down is Atlantis. Even though literally everybody on the planet talks about multiple continents going down, Atlantis is blamed for all of it. This literally has to stop. Like that's got to come to an end. And the only way we are going to accomplish that is if we deal with it. So let's deal with it right now. All right, so the concept of a sinking continent really does beg all kinds of questions right off the bat, right? Even if you just focus on Atlantis, there's a lot of questions we have to figure out. For example, one of those questions would be, how the hell did the continent sink? Like, what happened? How do you get a continent to sink literally overnight? Something's got to happen, right? And of course, people have all their own theories in the alternative mainstream. You know, we have all kinds of things from like, oh, there was some crazy super death war, and, you know, the continent went down because of their evil death rays. And then you have other people who will blame just general natural causes. You know, hey, really bad earthquake happened, the continent sank. You know, you've got a range in all of those areas. And so basically everybody is all over the map. Nobody is really forming a cohesive idea. And the reason why the mainstream alternative community can't do that is because nobody can get over all of their psychological conditioning. Yes, you might be able to believe at least one continent went down, but then when I tell you, oh, by the way, bro, there's like 2 or 3 other continents that other cultures all over this planet record sinking, a lot of people run away from that. And the reason why is because they're afraid to make that leap. So here, let me give you some bravery real fast. So let's think about this. If a continent were to sink, there's probably something major happening to Earth that would cause an event like that to happen. If a continent is going to sink, let's do this. Let's keep it extremely simple. Let's say a continent sinks because of one hell of an earthquake, right? We have Atlantis goes down because there was a, 1,000 on the Richter scale. It was just bad luck. Something happened. Continent goes down. If you have a continent sinking on Earth, regardless of what's going on, the entire planet is going to feel that event. I don't care where you are on Earth. If a continent sinks, you are going to know it. Now, you may not know what actually happened because you're on the other side of the planet, but you will feel the effects. You are going to feel insane earthquakes. Earthquakes that are going to completely change the land you live in. Why? Because the amount of energy that would be outputted by that kind of an event would necessarily absolutely rock the crust of the entire planet. Not only that, but then you also have to deal with the water situation. Can you imagine that? The ocean's all happy and calm with a giant piece of land sitting there, and all of a sudden that land just goes down overnight. The amount of displacement from that, the amount of changes in water levels, and the amount of energy that would surge through the oceans around the planet, that would create tsunamis on scales that are just insane. And that is just from one continent sinking on its own. So what that means is that there's going to be repercussions. Even if only one continent goes down, every single other piece of land on the planet is going to be affected. That means that there is no reason to believe that other continents would not have sank as well because of Atlantis sinking. Now, that's just a very, very basic thought experiment, but think about that. The ramifications for the land going down at that scale, it's going to be earth-changing completely. And that is just from a very simplistic perspective. Of course, the real question we have to, really figure out is how the hell did it sink? I mean, how do you sink a continent? Well, we actually probably know now. And we know because of historical records, whether they be auditory or written down. All cultures, including Plato, by the way, are very clear about what takes down these continents. And that is a celestial body that Earth has a very close run-in with multiple times. Now, for those of you familiar with some of this stuff on this channel, this would be the Venus event. This would be when the planet Venus was in a cometary mode and it flew by Earth multiple times, crossing over our orbit, and a couple of those times it got so close that the electromagnetic disturbances between the two planets essentially just ripped them apart. Earth felt it in the form of oceans being raised literally miles and miles above the land as it was electrically charged and gravitated towards Venus. We have a situation to where the crust on Earth would have been trying to adjust to the electromagnetic situation being created by these two charged bodies. And of course, the crust would have been crumpling, smashing, shifting, doing all kinds of stuff. You can guarantee that not only did Atlantis go down during this point in time, but that other continents went down as well. So when we look at the Atlantis situation, it's very important that we not take all of the sinking continent information from other historical sources, other cultures, and lump them all into one. We are never going to get a clear picture if we continue to do that. When somebody in New Zealand talks about a continent sinking to the north of them, you believe that. You don't think it's Atlantis. You would think it's Mu or Lemuria, right? One of the two. This is what they describe, right? And they have completely different events going on over there, which makes sense because they are on a different part of the world and they would have been affected differently than what the people up in the Mediterranean area would have been experiencing as well. And so, and this is actually one of the things that goes a long way into proving that these events actually took place. When we look at all of these ancient histories from all over the planet, their perspectives are fascinating because they really do tell it from their perspective geographically. And geographically, when you look up at the sky, for example, you're going to see something different if you're on the southern hemisphere relative to you being in the northern hemisphere. So not everybody would have been experiencing the exact same cosmological events seeing in the sky, but they would have felt the effects on Earth. And of course, once again, depending on how charged the area is that you live on, would be the dictator of what kind of destructive events you would see. Now, we see destruction all over this planet on a grand scale, which is also something we would expect to see if Earth did indeed run into a large cosmological body. All of this evidence really does point to one hell of an insane event, which does vindicate the concept of Atlantis. But just don't forget when you guys are doing this stuff that the other stories are legit, but they are not talking about Atlantis. All right, so that gets all that crap. So when we start to look at Plato now, relative to Atlantis, if I'm going to shift Plato's writings from 400-ish BC all the way up into 1300-ish AD, what does that do for the story of Atlantis? Because remember, one of the interesting things about the work of Timaeus from Plato, or Plato in this case, is the fact that we actually get a little bit of a date. We are told that 9,000 years have passed since that continent sank. And when we look at 9,000 years, they're not talking about 9,000 years from our current year 2000 perspective. You know, they're talking about it from, if you look at the mainstream, they would be saying something from around 400-ish BC on back. So it would be, what, 940 BC or whatever, you know, around 10,000 years or so is the date that people generally ascribe the sinking of Atlantis to. And this is why. I mean, the reason why they look at this date is because of the writings of Plato. Now, there's a few problems with the dating situation. Obviously, the first problem that we have to deal with is now we've cut out 1,800 years for when this story has been told. So if we look at it from a general mainstream chronological perspective, we will find a situation to where Atlantis did not sink around 10,000 BC. Instead, it would have sank around 8,000 BC. Now, this is annoying as well. People will probably think I'm just splitting hairs. That's just 2,000 years, bro. I mean, it's still kind of the same period of time, right? No, not at all. What, 2,000 years? Are you crazy? Do you know how much can happen in 2,000 years? That is huge. You do not just write off 2,000 years as like whatever. It's all fine. It's just a rough estimate. We don't need to worry about or calculate the real exact dates of anything. No, 2,000 years is a long time. That means that the sinking of Atlantis comes closer to us if we are using mainstream chronology and then also deleting the Dark Ages. Now it gets even crazier, because we have no reason to believe that the 9,000 years that is in Timaeus is 9,000 years in the way that we look at years now. And this is also one of the most important things that I see everybody ignore, obviously on the mainstream side of things, but the alternative side as well. Right? The alternative researching community is always so funny. I'm not talking crap, but it's hilarious because, they'll have no problem telling Egyptologists how wrong and stupid they are with respect to the pyramids being built for, tombs. And I agree, it's stupid. But then they have no problem believing scientists when scientists tell them, oh yeah, there's an ice age that was 10 to 12,000 years ago. No, we don't have any actual evidence for it, but you have to believe it. And then they do. People honestly believe this stuff, as if the mainstream could not be wrong when it comes to something like the Ice Age or now the Younger Dryas situation. No such thing as a Younger Dryas situation. We don't need it, and that is actually what this will actually go a long way into proving is not what happened. Okay, anyway. So, why do alternative mainstream people believe mainstream scientists on some things but not others, right? There's no evidence for the Ice Age that proves it conclusively, and yet people still incorporate that into their alternative research. That is a testament to the powerful level of psychological control that mainstream academia still has, even on alternative researchers. The reason why I say all that is because even if we now go with the 8,000 BC year date situation, we still find that we generally line up with what people consider the Ice Age, right? So people will be like, yeah, well, we don't know the exact year, so 8,000, 10,000, 12,000 years ago, it's all kind of the same thing. We're at least in the right ballpark, so we can just move on, right? And that's why people are fine with that date of 9,000 years, is because it lines up with the mainstream lie of the Ice Age, and by extension the Younger Dryas. So now what's happening in the mainstream community is that the mainstream alternative community, look, I'm all mad, I can't even talk anymore. The mainstream alternative community now looks at the Ice Age and they say, oh wow, you know what? So the ice caps must have melted. It must have flooded the world, and it only sank Atlantis. That's the excuse they give. If the Ice Age was real, like if it was a real thing, Atlantis would not be the only landmass that would have gone down. First of all, you would expect to have other land masses sinking as well, right? See, and people ignore that. They don't even offer that. They don't say, yeah, Atlantis and all these other lands went down. And I'm not speaking for every single person out there. I'm not. But this is basically how the alternative mainstream currently operates. They really do believe that there was, an Ice Age, a Younger Dryas event happened, all of that snow and ice melted, and then, I guess the waters rose, and then it sank a continent. Only one, by the way. Not a bunch of them, but only one. It doesn't even make sense. It literally makes no sense when you look at it from that perspective. So, anyway, yes, I realize I'm rambling. All right, let's calm down. Breathe. Okay, we're moving on. So, we have a date from Plato of 9,000 years. If we start to factor in real chronology, we can at least shave about 1,800 years off of that date, which brings the event, I'll just say the event, closer to us that sank Atlantis. Now that means something, because what that means is that we're already getting our dating systems wrong when we start to look at sinking continents from that perspective. The next problem is the dating systems themselves, and I rarely hear anybody address this when they talk about Timaeus and the 9,000 year situation. One of the things that we have to remember is that the years on the earth were not always 365 days and change. We know for a fact that at some point in time in recent history, and this was probably before the Venus event, that the original year was 360 days, and that for some weird reason, the moon literally orbited Earth in precisely 30 days. We have all kinds of archaeological evidence to support this particular period in time. Now, of course, most people look at this and just think, oh, well, they were all stupid. They didn't understand that it was 365. They couldn't figure that out. They weren't smart enough. They could build these huge pyramids and do all this crazy architecture stuff, and they could do all this cosmology, but, they just couldn't figure out the year correctly. This is probably one of the dumbest conclusions I have ever seen made by anybody in the history of history. Anybody who was able to calculate the year, who was able to build the kind of structures that they were building and deal with cosmological situations the way they were tracking them, would absolutely have no problem creating a legitimate, accurate calendar. So when we look back in time, what we can immediately deduce, because our ancestors tell us, is that the year was not 365. It was 360. Now it gets even crazier because the year was also not always 360 days. We have years of upwards of almost 300 days for particular periods in time as well. What this insinuates scientifically is that Earth's orbit was completely different only a few thousand years ago. And remember, these calendars are only that old. These calendars are not like 20 million years old or 20,000 years old. These calendars are that express a 360 day or like a high 200 year day. These are only a few thousand years old. This means then that Earth was in a completely different orbital situation only a few thousand years ago. So that is also, by the way, more evidence that goes a long way into proving the Venus event and how the Venus event completely screwed up the 360-day year. And yes, if you're wondering how the hell Earth got into an exact 360-day orbit around the sun, I have no idea. And then, of course, it gets even more insane when you look at the moon having an exactly 30-day orbit around the planet Earth. Yeah, the implications for that are absolutely insane. But we'll talk about it one day. That's probably even more schizo than what we're going through right now. But it's there. I mean, that's the historical evidence, and there's no way around it. I mean, that's it. It's all there. The archaeological evidence is there. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. So, if our ancestors had different calendars, what does that mean for this 9,000-year date? Well, it means that we cannot attribute the same 9,000 years as we experience a year now to the people who were living back then. What this means is that 9,000 years relative to how we look at the years now cannot be applied to somebody talking about 9,000 years 2,000 years ago. Right? It doesn't work like that. And the reason why is because the Earth was in a different orbit. So if we start to account for the differences in the years, if we start to say, okay, well, 9,000 years with, say, a 360-day calendar, suddenly those years start to be trimmed down. If we take it one step further and we look at other calendars, because we don't know the exact calendar, by the way, that this 9,000 years was actually based on. We have no information regarding that. So it's entirely possible that the story passed on to Solon was passed on from other people who were using different calendars in earlier time periods, but they did not communicate that to Solon. So he would have no idea what a reference to a real year would actually mean relative to the 9,000 years. So he just repeats what he hears. 9,000 years? All right, 9,000 years, blah, blah, move on, right? Because he doesn't know any different. You have to remember that even during the period of time when this story would have been recounted, people are, things are calmer during this period of time. They are not worried about cataclysms. Like a lot of this stuff, it's not even on their mind anymore because things have settled down. So the concept of a completely different calendar actually mattering and being real probably was not anywhere in the conversation, and obviously when we read the works, it's not there. So I can't tell you guys which calendar was actually used to generate that 9,000 year date. I don't know which one it was, but it would not have been a 365 day one. We can guarantee that. Now, it gets even crazier because, Solon's down there in Egypt. One of the other interesting things during the period of time when this story would have been heard, and by the way, this story would have been heard, probably in the 1100s AD, all right? So it's not BC, there's no BC. Everybody's chilling down there in Egypt having fun, 1100-ish AD. And by the way, these are probably the same people who are doing all the hieroglyphs. They didn't build the pyramids, but this civilization was probably the ones that are responsible for co-opting ancient Egypt. Yeah, that gets crazy too. Anyway, so there was a situation relative to calendars during this period of time to where the Egyptian month could actually be confused with the year. So since we have this case and we hear them saying 9,000 years, are we sure that they are not saying 9,000 months? That's a real possibility as well. Now, I don't have direct proof for either route, but we can look at it and we already know for a fact that we have to trim off some of the years relative to how we see a year now. But if we now start factoring in that maybe he meant 9,000 months, suddenly we're not dealing with all that many years. Suddenly that starts to actually fit into real chronology even better because our history is not 9,000 years old. Or I guess I should say the history that we're talking about relative to Atlantis sinking is not 9,000 years old. Atlantis probably did not go down any later than maybe 2,000 to 3,000 years max. All right, and I know that's kind of a broad spectrum. I only say that because I can't give you an exact date yet. But reading Plato like we are looking at it now, realizing that Plato did not exist in 300 BC or 400 BC or whatever, that he is a Renaissance character, that puts the entire dating system into a completely different perspective, and it helps explain what was going on in Egypt around the 1100s AD. What kind of civilization was there? Because the way that Solon is getting talked to at that period of time, remember, they're just basically a remnant of a culture that was there before them. They don't take credit for building the pyramids, right? They're not there. They just say, hey, look, we have this huge labyrinth. Come check it out, bro. And that's what they're doing, right? It's like Disneyland for them. They didn't build any of that stuff. They just lived there during that period of time. So it also begs the question, how messed up is their chronology during that period of time? Right? This is the issue that we suffer and that we face when we start to really take this seriously. So we can't just blindly say, oh yeah, 9,000 years, oh, it must be attributed to the Ice Age melting and blah, blah. You can't do that. You literally cannot do that. It's unscientific and it's not historically accurate. Now, the good news here, once we go through all of these gymnastics, the good news is that once we start to look at the problem of Atlantis and sinking continents in general through this light, suddenly our history starts to become more cohesive. Things start to make a little more sense. Now, of course, it also brings up all kinds of new questions, but what's interesting about the new questions is that if you ask the newer questions relative to your other studies, for example, trying to figure out, all the dynasties in ancient Egypt, you suddenly shed an entire light on all of that crap and you realize how much of that is absolutely just mainstream, being completely and totally wrong, right? Mainstream, they're just looking for the answer. They don't care where it comes from. They just need some way to explain something so they can get their degree, they can continue to get paid their funding, and then they move on with life. They are not interested in changing the paradigm. But when we start to look at the problem of Atlantis and Plato through real chronology, and by that I mean getting rid of the Greek Dark Ages, deleting 1,800 years out of that period of time, suddenly supposedly ancient Greece makes infinitely more sense if you bring it up into the Renaissance period and the Middle Ages period of time, right? I mean, just think about that, right? If you have all this crazy philosophical stuff going on down there in Byzantium, why wouldn't it also be going on all over that entire area? This entire period of time is an amazing scholarly learning period, right? It's going on in Europe. Why would it not also simultaneously be going on in Byzantium, as well as North Africa? And in fact, history supports all of this. The only thing that does not support this particular point of view is mainstream chronology. Now, Plato might have had an accidental hand in kind of ruining chronology as well, because like I said at the beginning, Plato, if he wrote all of Plato's works, which it looks like he probably did, he was not interested in getting credit for it directly, right? He did not want to be executed. So he said, yeah, this guy, I found these books named Plato. They're all these cool philosophies, and they were written like 1,000 years ago, because during his period of time, it would have been 1,000 years, not 1,800. So yeah, so Plato, while he's trying to hide his own writing, may have accidentally created the situation of ancient Greece and ultimately the Hellenistic period. Then the problem of chronology gets compounded even further when chronologists in the 1400s to the 1600s, people like Petavius and Scaliger, they start trying to make up real chronologies, and they are sourcing books and they are sourcing dates like Plato's Plato books. And so they look at those dates and they say, well, I guess this stuff had to have happened back in 300 BC. This lines up with this other forgeries that we have and blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly you have an entirely wrong chronology that's done on accident and on purpose simultaneously. Yeah, dude, the situation is it's bonkers. It's hilarious how absolutely messed up real chronology is, at least the way the mainstream teaches it. And we have a long way to go to figure all of this out. So anyway, when we're trying to date Atlantis and we're trying to figure out, A, is it even possible that it could sink? Yes, scientifically speaking, it could sink. Yes, that's possible. B, when did it sink? Well, right now, mainstream chronology tells us at best it would have been like 10 to 12,000 years ago. But real history and real chronology and real science shows us that it was only a few thousand years ago that this would have happened. And then, of course, if we really start to look at all the societies and we really start to look at people coming out of that destructive history actually makes even more sense. Because, it's funny, when you start to look at everybody's history on this planet for the past, I'd say about 1,000 years or so, it literally looks like every single culture on this planet is exiting or recovering from some kind of a horrific cataclysmic event. And that's exactly what we see, right? And that what that's done is that's created this false sense of constant improvement, because we only have history, reliable history, that really only goes back a few hundred years. And when you look at that history, you mainly just see a very steady progression towards a technologically advanced civilization. Of course, you have to ignore all the crazy old stuff, like all the pyramids and all, Baalbek and stuff like that, which the mainstream does, because they don't want to, because they really do like that upwards trend on the graph of human progression. Nobody wants to look at human progression and see it start at the top, then it drops down to the bottom, and then it slowly starts to recover, then it drops down again, and then once again it starts to recover. That is exactly what we actually see in history, but the mainstream cannot admit that. Okay, I don't even know where I'm going with this anymore. So, see what I'm saying? Atlantis has to be dated differently. It was probably a real event. And Plato probably heard this real story from the real priests that existed down there in northern Egypt. Now, is he relaying what Solon told? Yeah, I don't know. I can't tell you the exact dates. Plato may have, he may have created names, he may have obfuscated names, he may have obfuscated locations relative to where the story was heard. I don't know. He could have done stuff to make sure that he was not tracked down. We have to remember that as well, right? If he was willing to essentially make up Plato, then who knows what else he did to kind of cover his tracks. And I'm not getting on him like it's a bad thing. I completely understand why you would obfuscate your tracks. But when we start to study something like Atlantis and you use Plato as a source, you have got to remember all of the stuff that I just ranted on in this show. And yeah, let's call it here. We get it, right? So I'm done. I don't even know if I stayed on topic. Probably didn't.